welcome you to this special pre-budget meeting. It is hosted by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Green New Deal, alongside the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Limits to Growth, which I chair with Clive Lewis from the Labour Party, who is also with us this morning. We are so delighted to be joined by some of the world's leading experts on how the economic recovery from COVID-19 can also reshape our economy and society in a way that enables us to meet our Paris Agreement commitments, that regenerates the green spaces that we've relied on so much during the pandemic, that ensures good jobs are available for everyone, and delivers on promises to level up right across the UK. So joining us this morning are Dr. Suzy Morrissey from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of New Zealand, whose work on a living standards framework fed into the 2019 Wellbeing budget. And a particular thank you to Suzy for being with us today, given that it's 10 o'clock at night in New Zealand. So we're very, very grateful to you. We have Lord Adair Turner, Senior Fellow of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and former Chair of the Financial Services Authority. A big thank you to Lord Turner, who was with us until 9:45, but then has to leave for another meeting. Miatta Fahnbulleh is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, and Robert Palmer, Chief Executive of Tax Justice UK. Thank you also to members of the public and the policy community who are also joining us this morning. I think we're nearly up to 100 now, 97, so that's wonderful to see you this morning as well. So before we hear from our first expert, I just wanted to say a few words to set the context for our discussion. We're basically here to discuss what should be in the Chancellor's red box next week if it is to deliver the transformative green recovery that a growing number of leading businesses and public want to see. And crucially, I think we're here to explore how that can be financed and what kind of frameworks we're going to need to guide us going forward. And I think it's clear that what we need is bold, decisive action. And right now, there's not enough of that around. According to the OECD's chief economist, Laurence Boone, we have entered what she calls a new era of debt sustainability. And it's an era, if you like, that the policymakers haven't yet caught up with and adjusted to. And her message in a way is quite simple, that we can afford what needs to be done. So neither has the Chancellor adjusted to the scale and speed at which action on climate and nature is needed, nor the potential, I think, for it to improve lives and livelihoods. I think it's quite interesting to compare where we're at in the UK with the situation now in the US, where President Biden's multi-part executive order, which was signed just a month ago, embedded the imperative to address the climate emergency across every single part of government. And there's a whole array of new kind of architecture to enable that to happen, a new Office of Domestic Climate Policy, for example, to coordinate action across government, a National Climate Task Force comprising 21 government agency leaders, and Environmental Justice Interagency Council to address racial and economic inequities exacerbated by climate change and by air and water pollution. And while our Chancellor is still talking about the so-called sacred duty to balance the books, in the US, what they've seen is a $2 trillion green recovery plan. That is now on the cards. That amounts to nearly 9% of US GDP compared to our stimulus, which is closer to around 2% of GDP in the UK. And as one climate analyst remarked, breathtaking really is the word, and breathtaking, frankly, is what we need to see. A report for the UN by leading international scientists concluded that the estimated investment costs between 2020 and 2024 to deliver on the Paris Agreement is roughly half of the post-pandemic stimulus packages that have been announced so far. That means that our stimulus packages must also be green recovery packages. As the World Economic Forum's Nature and Business report set out, and I quote, as the world prepares to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting crisis, we are presented with an unprecedented clarion call and opportunity to change the way we eat, live, grow, build, and power our lives to achieve a carbon neutral, nature positive economy and to halt biodiversity loss by 2030. Business as usual, they say, is no longer an option. Well, we couldn't agree more. And that idea of a nature positive economy was picked up by Professor Dasgupta in his review for the Treasury, which was published earlier this month. In it, you'll recall he called for urgent and transformative change in how we measure economic success, recognising that GDP fails to account for nature and is driving the pursuit of uneconomic and unsustainable economic growth. Now that's echoed by a new UN climate science report, which warns unequivocally that economic stimulus focused primarily on growth would indeed jeopardise the Paris Agreement. So that's why today we're not just talking about what the Chancellor should be investing in and how, but also about how we can guide a recovery that builds an economy that supports human and ecological flourishing, an economy where everyone has access to a well-paid job, where no one goes hungry, where our health service is properly funded and resourced, our air is clean, our streets are safe and calm, and our green spaces abundant. As I say, we are really delighted to be joined today by 4 experts who can help us unpick what we need to see from the Chancellor next Wednesday if we are to build back a greener and fairer Britain. So each of our experts will present their thoughts in turn, followed by questions from us, from MPs and peers, and if there's time, 1 or 2 questions from people joining us on the webinar. For people on the webinar, please suggest your questions using the Q&A function. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Clive Lewis, who will introduce our first expert.
Thanks, Caroline. I appreciate that. So to begin with, we'd like to welcome Dr. Suzy Morrissey, who's speaking on behalf of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of New Zealand, who, when she was working for the New Zealand Treasury, was responsible for the living standards framework that underpinned the 2019 Wellbeing budget. We're particularly grateful to Dr. Morrissey for joining us as it's extremely late in New Zealand. So Dr. Morrissey, over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Clive. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the session. So yes, so I'm one of the founders of the Aotearoa Hub of the Wellbeing Economics Alliance, and I've been part of WEAL for a number of years, and you may know that Aotearoa New Zealand is also part of the WeGov Alliance that the WEAL runs as well. So we're very well connected into this space. And as you say, I'm a public servant, and when I was at Treasury, I helped to develop and launch the Living Standards Framework. So I'll reflect on those experiences a little bit with you. So firstly, to expand on what Caroline had said about GDP critiques, the importance of alternative measures, what they are and what they can do. So it's very important to record our measures of damage and utilisation of finite resources. So need to be sure about understand what we're doing with respect to waste generation, pollution of air and water, use of fossil fuels, where still occurring. We also need measures that record positive contributions that may otherwise be unrecognised or unrewarded in classical GDP calculations. So volunteering and care and domestic work are the clearest examples of those. Depending on the country, you may also want to be thinking about measures that reflect unique characteristics that you want to protect, native flora and fauna, especially if they're unique to your particular part of the world. And within all of that, the most important thing to then be thinking about is distributional analysis to show exactly who and where is improving or declining. Most of us will recognise that averages do not necessarily provide an accurate picture of any individual's actual lived experience. And so of course, to design policy, you need to understand individual needs and consider a range of demographic features, including geographic. So even in a small country like Aotearoa, we still have major differences on a geographic basis, even beyond just the classic urban-rural kind of divide. So I suspect we're all on one view that we need more than just GDP, and for all of those good reasons. So what did we do in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So I'll speak a little about what the LSF, the Living Standards Framework, is, and then I'll just give some context for it. So the Living Standards Framework is, classic in some respects with respect to economics. It's a stocks and flows model of well-being. It has domains of current well-being representing flow and capitals for future well-being, which you might think of as stock. It's based on the OECD's Better Life Index that I'm sure you're familiar with. So the positives of their framework being based on a model like the OECD's, certainly it allows international comparison, which some people will consider important, and it uses a dashboard of measures which contrasts with some other ways of looking at well-being where they may focus on particular elements, for example, happiness or subjective well-being. Critiques might include the fact that it ignores international comparisons on other countries. So, for example, the contributions to global temperature rising and rising sea levels, which obviously happen in other jurisdictions but impact on us. And then, because it is very international in focus, it does largely ignore the uniqueness of Aotearoa, especially our Māori culture. Although one change was made from the Better Life Index structure to the Living Standards Framework structure, which was to include an additional domain of current well-being of cultural identity, to try and start to address that gap and kind of make it more particular to New Zealand. So the Living Standards Framework came about through the work of the New Zealand Treasury. So it's often thought about with respect to the Wellbeing budget and as a government initiative, but just to be very clear, Wellbeing framework, the Living Standards Framework was first worked on back in 2010 by the Treasury. So Treasury had recognised themselves that they needed something more than GDP, and then they needed a framework that would allow analysis that captured that broader perspective. It was refreshed, quite significantly amended in 2017, which is the piece of work that I was a part of. And then what happened in 2017 was we had a change of government, and the incoming government looked at the Living Standards Framework that we had created and decided that they wanted to use it to inform their wellbeing budget. And so that's that chain of events. As you can imagine, the work then progressed very quickly to complete the work that we were doing on the Living Standards Framework, including to finalise all the measures that we would include on our dashboard so that we could measure progress. The dashboard is now available on the Treasury website and New Zealand Treasury website, and you might wish to look at that at some point, and I can provide links and details to Ruth for handing on. So 2019, as you know, was the first official wellbeing budget. The Living Standards Framework had also helped to inform the 2018, the first budget that Labor were able to hand down, or the Labor coalition government was able to hand down, but very much the 2019 budget was the wellbeing budget. And I think that is the same with respect to Westminster, a national budget handed down largely on budget night, yeah. So, as I said, the Living Standards Framework is largely based on the BLI, and the indicators that were chosen for measurement are quite similar to the ones that have been used there. So they weren't exactly created by New Zealanders ourselves. The process that was followed was to commission a proposal. Treasury commissioned a proposal by a contractor, and which was released for feedback. So the public were able to comment on that, but it was commenting on a proposal rather than bottom-up generation. And I'll give you the contrast, because at the same time, our stats, our ONS equivalent Stats New Zealand, were undertaking a project called Indicators Aotearoa, which was also a set of measures to measure wellbeing. They have a larger set, and as it's turned out, the Living Standards Framework measures are generally a subset of the Indicators Aotearoa set. But the way that Stats went about creating their framework was, as they were bottom up, they went out and spoke to the community, to children. They were in schools, getting them to fill out postcards of what well-being meant to them. So they very much kind of generated what a much more Aotearoa-centric kind of perspective of well-being, if you like. So there are a couple of ways that you can, go about this if you decided to undertake a sort of framework measure like that. So the question, I suppose, then is, from the last few years, what has this meant for Aotearoa New Zealand? You'll be aware, I'm sure, that we've pledged to go carbon neutral by 2025, stopped issuing offshore oil and gas exploration permits, held a Just Transition Summit to then help that region that was the most affected by that decision to remove permits, to explore other opportunities that were greener. There's also the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy. They have a much smaller set of 6 outcomes and I think 20 indicators to measure wellbeing. Again, they were generated by the young people themselves. Child poverty reduction has been a large part of the wellbeing work, and we've included compulsory reporting now annually as part of the budget process on child poverty. And then, because I know you're all at the national level, but also, of course, local government is very important. So another change was to reintroduce the wellbeings into the Local Government Act. So the local governments being required to promote the social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing of communities in the present and for the future is a quote from the legislation there. I think that's very important, of course, because of the impact on public amenities like green space, like accessibility into public places, physical language, all of these potential barriers to people. So local government obviously has a role to play. And then in the bigger picture, of course, there's the Paris Agreement on climate change, which we had signed. So that's a little bit about why you might do this, what the LSF is and how it came to be. I thought it might be important to just then talk about operationalising and how that looks in practice. So the biggest impact that has is every year in the budget, I'm not sure if the process is the same in the UK, but individual departments, ministries would put bids in for what they would like to get in the budget. And in New Zealand, when those bids come in from departments, ministries, they are then assessed against the Living Standards Framework. So you have to explain which domains of current wellbeing will be improved through this budget bid. And that's the biggest kind of factor, the most obvious sort of change to the whole process. Now, of course, that is, as many of us will know, the budget is only in New Zealand at least, the budget is only additional funds that are being given to departments, and their baseline funding generally remains the same. So we've also undertaken some baseline reviews where we've actually looked at the entire appropriation that a ministry or department is receiving, and again, use the Living Standards Framework as a guide for that analysis. So those are a couple of the larger examples of how it's been operationalised. And then on a smaller level, some individual ministries or departments have taken the Living Standards Framework and used it themselves in their own ways. So they're kind of in a sort of adaptive process for what they're doing. So that's really a kind of overview of what has been going on. I thought I would just give all of that, and then you could select which areas you might want to hear more about.
Thank you, Dr. Morrissey. I think we appreciate that very much, and especially your time staying up so late to give that briefing. Before I open up to the panel for questions, and if you could just use your electronic hand or your physical hand to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, I'd be extremely grateful. But I'm going to use Chair's prerogative and ask the first question, which is, it's quite topical. And do you think it's possible that the existence of the wellbeing budget influenced the New Zealand government's response to the COVID crisis?
I think it's certainly possible. It meant that there was a framework in place to do your analysis, to consider your options. So I can only imagine that it was helpful for them as they went through it.
Okay, thank you. Baroness Lister, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Could you tell us a bit more about, was there a big difference between the kind of top-down indicators that were developed and the bottom-up? And how far has the kind of development of the bottom-up indicators involved the general population in the development of the well-being policies?
Yeah, certainly. So they very much were involved in the generation of them. But I suppose it's true to say that on the biggest picture level, things like income and health and housing and clean water, swimmable rivers, these things are all, they're very common to all of us in the country. So so there is a lot of crossover in the end from the indicators that were chosen by stats with the ones from Treasury. It's probably worth noting at this point as well that in the selection of indicators, of course, the key required element there is data. If you're going to be reporting on something, you actually need the data, which you may or may not have been collecting, depending on the priorities that you've set for recent research. So I think there was, I think it's fair to say there was an element of practicality that also went alongside that what people had expressed as important also needed to be something that was going on already to capture that data. But yes, quite a strong crossover between the two.
Thank you, Dr. Morrissey. We've got time for one more question, quick question and one quick answer. So Barry Gardiner, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thanks very much. Could you give us an example of how the performance of the bid for additional resources has been monitored? And then if it's failed to actually achieve that aspect of well-being that it's set out to achieve, what enforcement procedure there then is to remediate that?
Sure. The short answer is that I'm not aware of any procedure to check that afterwards. So sometimes there will be policy evaluations, but it's fair to say that doesn't always happen certainly not for every bid.
Right. So there's no way of ensuring that what was promised is actually delivered.
I mean, so larger policies will no doubt have an evaluation piece, a monitoring piece that accompanies it, and then with an evaluation after a couple of years. It's not the case that happens with every policy that's introduced. So there may be some. I can have a look, see if there's some examples of evaluations that have already happened, bearing in mind the wellbeing budget was only 2 years ago.
Sure.
Just
briefly, can I say?
Sorry.
Regards to Candy Graham.
Thank you very much, Barry. Sorry, I thought you were asking another question there, but I know we're really tight on time. Thank you, Dr. Morrissey, so much for that very comprehensive presentation and for staying up so late again to take part in our APPG today. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we can be back in touch with you to check if there's other information that we need to follow up with. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yes, more than happy to help.
Thank you, Dr. Morrissey. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much. And yes, thank you. That was really inspiring. Next, we'd like to welcome Lord Turner, a senior fellow, as I said, of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and as former chair of both the Financial Services Authority and the Committee on Climate Change, as well as a much valued member of the All-Party Group on Limits to Growth. He is someone uniquely placed to reflect on both how best to navigate an economic crisis and also how that might also enable us to better respond to the interlinked climate and nature crises. So over to you, Lord Turner, and thank you for joining us.
Caroline, thank you very much. Can I just say that in addition to being a former chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, what I spend most of my time at the moment on is the chair of a thing called the Energy Transition Commission, which is a global commission working in Europe, but also in India and China extensively on how we build zero carbon economies. But this morning, I'm going to focus really on the issue of the UK and the question Caroline asked right at the beginning, which is what should be in the budget next week. I think the first thing to begin to say is, and I am going to focus primarily on what do we need to build a zero carbon economy, but in what ways can building a zero carbon economy also help a more effective and inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. I will share one slide because I think it is useful. Hopefully I'll be able to do it. Oh, it says the host has disabled screen sharing, in which case I won't bother. But I want to simply say, if you want to understand what the UK does needs to do to build a zero carbon economy, you can do nothing better than to get the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget report to go to page 245, which is figure 5.1. And there they set out the investments required to build a zero carbon economy. And I think the analysis they've done is compelling and detailed. And what it says is that the UK has to increase its investment by about £50 billion per annum, which is order of magnitude over the period, about 1% of GDP on average over the period from now to 2050. But what is interesting is that the investments which they describe can be thought of as essentially involving 3 elements. Now, those are investments in electric transport, investments in an electric supply, a zero carbon electricity supply system, and investments in the residential building stock in investing, installing heat pumps and making insulation more efficient. Now, as it happens, we at the Energy Transition Commission have slightly different point of view on the relative balance of those. We think they have probably overstated the extent of the investment of people of buying electric vehicles, because we think that electric vehicles within 5 years will be cheaper to buy up front than internal combustion engines. So we don't think there is an extra cost there. On the other hand, I think if anything, they may have underdone how much is needed in the residential housing stock. But let's take their overall point of view as absolutely right. The absolutely core of what we've got to do is build a massively bigger zero carbon electricity system, a system capable by 2050 of delivering about 2.5 times as much electricity as the UK delivers at the moment, and with all of that electricity zero carbon. And we have to dramatically improve the insulation efficiency and install heat pumps in our housing stock. And actually, that's sort of 80 or 90% of what we have to do. And it's important to realize that all of the investment in changing your cement kilns or your steel mills or all of the other things that you have to do, though important, are relatively small compared with those 2 big things. So my second point is, can this program deliver more jobs? Now, it is important to be realistic about the transition to a zero carbon economy. It is not the most important thing that will happen on jobs. Again, if you look at the CCC report on figure B5.6 on page 285, they say that the move to a zero carbon economy could increase employment by about 1%. That's about 250,000, 300,000 extra jobs. That's good, that's beneficial, but just realize that there are going to be some very big job swings in our economy coming from digitalization and automation over the next several years, which are probably bigger than that. I think we're probably going to come out of COVID-19 losing 1.5 million jobs in retail and only creating another 0.5 million jobs in the online retailing replacement of that. And that's a big challenge. So this of what the green economy can do is a useful offset for that, but don't dream that it's everything. This is 1% at the margin on a big figure of 30 million jobs. However, what we do know is where the big positives are. There will be some negatives. Let me be clear that when you make electric vehicles are much simpler, technically much more beautiful engines than internal combustion engines. They have a small fraction of the moving parts, and that means there are going to be less people employed in automotive manufacturing across the world once we fully electrify. That is absolutely certain to occur because we're moving from an incredibly complicated, difficult to make engine to a simple engine. We will also eventually have much less jobs in vehicle maintenance. All those visits to the garage because, you know, one or other bit of this fancy internal combustion engine has gone wrong, they're going to disappear. Electric engines don't break down. Once you've bought them, they last forever. There are electric engines, you know, driving railways in Switzerland, which have been running for 100 years, but that means less jobs there. But the big positive job is, again, in that housing and insulation space. And again, there's a very good chart. I haven't got the precise reference here within, no, it's figure 6.1, which is where exactly the extra jobs will come from. And they are above all in insulating the housing stock. As many as 250, 260,000 extra jobs could be created. And they're great jobs in this sense. They're not jobs just focused on particular industrial clusters. They are jobs everywhere where there are houses, i.e. everywhere where there are people. They are jobs which by definition are spread equally across the whole of the economy. And they are jobs for plumbers and plasterers and tilers and, you know, everything to do with making housing more efficient. That is a major opportunity, and that is an opportunity on which we should be focusing. And if you look at figure 5.1 and at figure 6.1, the thing I would focus on is, can we bring forward that employment and that investment, both for reasons to do with climate and to reasons to do with our recovery from the crisis? Because what the CCC shows in its figures at the moment is a ramping up from now to 2030, and then a high level in the 2030s and 40s. I would really concentrate on whether we could bring that forward. So my third point is, how do we pay for this and who do we pay for it? When we are talking about the big investments which are required in building a zero carbon electricity system, provided we get our power market design right, our structure of what are called contracts for difference and auctions, the vast majority of that money will come from private capital rather than on the balance sheet of the government itself. Provided we have a low risk environment for the development of the North Sea with really stretching targets for developing our electricity system there in particular, you will see private capital queuing up to invest at relatively low rates of return, because the only other thing they can do with their money is give it to the government at real returns of -1%. So there's a set of this which will be primarily private. But now let's switch to this issue of the residential housing stock. The way to think about it is 25 million households, all of which are going to have to spend, the CCC says, about £10,000 on average to retrofit their homes. I think that may be more like 15,000 or more. I'm just a little bit worried that they've undercooked it, but that's the order of magnitude. And who's going to pay for that? Well, the answer is, I think it has to be a mix. I think under upper income, wealthier people, you simply have to sort of force and regulate them to say, you have got to spend money to insulate your house better. You know, you've got to find that 15,000 quid. I think there is a layer of society where there is a lot of opportunity to create thoughtful public-private partnerships with the big mortgage lenders. And I would really explore this as to, can we create easy mechanisms where somebody who already has a mortgage can add 10 or 15,000 pounds on it to invest in improving the quality of their housing stock, which is, of course, an investment, because once they've done it, they will have lower fuel bills. It's a positive rate of return, but for some people who are capital constrained, they can't seize that. But we will have a slice of the population where I think we will have to have public money to drive this. The lower income groups, and sometimes it is the lower income groups who are in some of the worst bits of the housing stock. And then, of course, there's a crucial thing on social housing as well, where we have to think there about whether we use the public balance sheet and public expenditure to support a significant, not the whole, but a tranche of this major and job-creating employment in the housing stock. Final comment, if that means that we've got to spend public money, where does it come from? Well, let's be clear, and Caroline mentioned this earlier, or somebody mentioned this earlier, the total sums of money here are not large compared with what we are already spending on dealing with the COVID. If you look at figure 5.1 from the CCC, they think that we have to take residential building expenditure up to about £15 billion per annum. Some of that with higher income people can and should be paid privately. Some can go on mortgages. What are we talking about in public expenditure? Maybe 5, maybe 8 billion per annum. This is really small compared with the amount that we are spending on the furlough scheme. And I think that is what we've got to be saying is the priority. And I think we've got to be saying it's a priority to look at the figure of 5.1 and say, can't we bring that forward? Can't we have that in place within 1 or 2 years rather than 5 or 6? Both because 0 by 2050 is not enough. It's not enough for the world and it's not enough for us. We've got to get dramatic reductions in the 2020s as well. So really bringing that curve forward, I think is something we've got to do for the climate, but I think it's something which could do in the help for recovery. And in an environment where, as I say, as we come out of this crisis, I think we will have a major jobs problem because that accelerated trend in retail from bricks and mortar retailing to online retailing, which has been accelerated because of the crisis, I think will be with us as a big problem and a big employment problem as soon as we get rid of these furlough schemes. So that is where a big thing I would focus on for next week. As for are there constraints? Look, as somebody said, the OECD has said debt is now sustainable with low rates of interest. Debt is also sustainable because if necessary, we could take some of the Bank of England's purchases of a government debt and actually can't write that off. That is absolutely possible. Central bankers will tell you it's impossible because it's just part of the belief system of central bankers. But we have had this huge quantitative easing. Probably most of that should eventually be reversed, but some of that could be permanent as an extra way of dealing with this supposed debt burden, which it turns out is much less of a debt burden than we thought it was. So let me end there.
Brilliant. A tour de force. Thank you so much for that. I must say it does make me want to weep even more over the mess of the Green Homes Grant to hear you, reinforce how important it is to get home insulation, that basic building block in place before we go much further. But I'm going to abuse my position too and ask you the first question, which is just to lead on a little bit from where you left off. In terms of that kind of overt monetary financing, as you say, it's perfectly possible, and yet it's always deemed to be quite heretical to suggest it. Do you have any advice for how, if we do want to push that further, we might try to get some of the powers that be in Treasury to begin to accept that?
Well, look, the argument I have made for overt monetary finance has made it plain that I still recognize the political risks. Let's be clear what goes on with overt monetary finance. There is no doubt whatsoever that it's technically possible. It is also true that it entails a political risk, because if everybody knows that overt monetary finance is possible, they might want to do it to an excessive extent, which creates inflation. So when I did a paper for the IMF in 2015, I entitled it An Overt Monetary Finance, an Essentially Political Issue. The issue is essentially, how do you create a structure which allows you to do it while still being certain that you will not overuse it? And the reason why there's a central bank orthodoxy against it, the reason why lots of central bankers argue, even though they know it's not the case, that it's technically impossible, is they're terrified of letting the political bag out of the, cat out of the bag and not being able to control it. That is why I have argued that we should locate the role of overt monetary finance within an inflation targeting framework, that you should give to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England the authority to decide whether some of QE will be permanent, and that you should make it permanent if you believe that that is compatible with an inflation target, and not if you don't. And I think if you believe that, if you set that, you have an answer to this real political issue. As I say, you get a lot of chaff in this area to do with technical issues about how you remunerate reserves at the central bank, whether this is a tax on future bank credit intermediation. The answer is yes, it is, but it's a good idea. So there are a set of technical answers. What you've got to do in order to make this, get this debated, is to create a compelling, convincing argument of how you're going to root it in a political structure which makes sure that it does not get abused. I think that's what you've got to do.
Thank you so much. I hope you've got time for just one or two very quick questions. I know you have to go any second, but could we quickly go to Wera Hobhouse?
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Laura Turner. Absolutely fascinating and very clear, even for somebody who doesn't really think in this world, what you're asking for. Can I just, so you put the headline figure of 15 billion per annum for this whole big program of home improvements and home insulation and so on and so forth there. But we all know that this is not just money that you just hand out as it is, but you create some sort of mechanisms for incentives and disincentives. For example, although it doesn't always work, but let's say the contracts for differences that have been a big driver for the renewable energy sector. Can you just sort of point at a sort of market mechanism that you think would work in that context?
I think the crucial thing in the housing context is don't overcomplicate it. Remember, the Conservative Alliance government of 2010 introduced something which was called the Green New Deal, different Green New Deal. And it was an incredibly complicated thing where, you were going to be able to lend money to individuals in order that they would reduce their fuel bills in total. And fundamentally, almost nothing happened, right? And the reason why nothing happened is, there's a small number of people in the world called economists and business people who sit down during the day and of an evening and run spreadsheets in which they work out the net present value of investment projects. Ordinary human beings, as against economists, don't do that, right? Nobody sits down of an evening with a spreadsheet and says, oh, I invested this and, put in, LED light bulbs. I'm going to invest this and save that. So my rate of, you're just not going to get most people to do that. So you need to use other instruments. You need to use just a more straightforward combination of regulation and tax incentive, stuff like, first of all, variation of stamp duty according to how efficient your house is. If you don't get your house in a better order, when you try to sell it to somebody, they're going to pay higher stamp duty, or maybe you're going to have to pay a stamp duty on exit. You could do that. You could differentiate council tax. You could say, right, if your house isn't, insulated, I'm going to charge you a higher council tax because you're imposing an externality on the rest of us. Or you simply have to do it by grants, by saying, this is available to you, please take it. I think when you're in the space of, how do you decarbonize steel mills? How do you decarbonize cement plants? How do you decarbonize offshore wind? Yes, you use complicated market instruments like CFDs. But I think when you get down to, this is a £10,000 investment in 25 million houses, you've got to keep the policy instruments simpler than that. So I would be wary of overcomplication.
Do you have any more minutes, Lord?
Just one more minute. Yeah, and then I better go.
There are loads of people in the chat, but there's also Barry, and I'm in a so Barry, can you be really quick, and I might sneak one in extra from the chat as well.
Indeed. Constraints you talked about. Two constraints, how would you deal with them? One is domestic householders' resistance at the disruption,
Yeah.
But the key one, I think, is the skills base. What Green Homes has shown is actually we don't have the skills base in order to do this work. And what is the time lag that there's going to be before we actually can build the skills base? Because you quite rightly talk about bringing this work forward as a job creation element. But actually, if we haven't got the skills, we can't.
Could I just add on to that, Lord Turner? There's one of the questions in the chat that was saying, will the jobs in housing and retrofit and so forth be short term? What happens when those jobs are done?
Well, first on this rather one, they're short term in the sense of they last for about 25 years. But let's bother with that question once we've done the whole of the housing stock, right? So let's be clear, once we've built a zero carbon economy, actually, one of the reasons why it's so cheap is that it doesn't employ many people. So we'll have to have another answer after about 2045, 2050. But let's focus on the next 25 years for now. For 20 years, 25 years, retrofitting our housing stock can probably employ 250,000 people throughout that period. That's useful, and we'll deal with the far future once we get to there. Barry's questions, I think, are great ones. And I think, in a way, part of the reason why the CCC may have shown that ramp up only getting there by the late 2020s, I don't know, might be a belief that it is skill constrained. So I think what we really need is a very, very strong focus. And I think the way to think about it is we know that we need to do that ramp up of expenditure which is required for the climate and is job creating. We've got a set of scenarios that show that having a big effect by the late 2020s. What does it take to get that forward into the early 2020s? The easy bit is probably the public finance side of just saying, let's find 5 billion, 10 billion a year in the budgets over the next 3 years. The bigger bit, and it needs a real focus, is where are the skills? How rapidly can we get those skills in place? And the great thing is we know what skills are required. This isn't a generic thing. You know, what are these skills? Are there enough of them? How many apprentices? We should have a strong focus on that. Barry, you're absolutely right also to focus on the fact that, you know, one of the challenges in this place is just the hassle factor, right? You know, you've got to have a builder turn up and do it. You know, I mean, at the moment, people are working from home, but, you know, once we get beyond that, you know, you've got somebody has got to stay at home from work to be there while the work is required. It's disruptive. There's 3 days of dust, etc. There is just the sort of hassle factor that puts people off doing this. I think, again, we can't entirely get rid of that. So there's got to be some sticks and carrots to overcome that. But we also need to try and make it as easy as possible. How do we have, say, certification systems for who are really good quality builders whom people can trust? You've got to create it. You've got to make it easy for people to say, I want a package of heat pump insulation and insulation. Somehow I've managed to create a trusted set of builders whom I know will do this to high quality at a good price. I think we've got to think creatively about that. But you are absolutely right that the hassle factor, the sheer hassle factor, is also an important challenge here. But I now have to go to.
You do. You're 5 minutes late. I'm so sorry.
Carbon adjustments with another gratitude report. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Over to Clive for our next speaker.
Thanks, Caroline. So next, we'd like to welcome Miatta Fahnbulleh, the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, and an economist with experience of generating new ideas to reshape the economy from outside government and from inside government when she worked in the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So over to you, Miatta, for your 7 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to start by reiterating the point that Caroline made at the start of this, which is the economic backdrop to this budget is absolutely immense. And it's not just the fallout from the pandemic, 11% contraction of the economy last year, 2.6 million projected unemployment by mid this year, the huge income squeeze that we're seeing across the country. But it's also the fact that the last year, I think, has exposed deep structural problems that were there with the economy anyway. Squeeze in living standards for well over a decade, unprecedented. How denuded our social protections have become, whether that's through underinvestment in frontline services like health or social care, or the complete paucity and inadequacy of our social security system, and the cost and the untold suffering of not preparing for this sort of natural crisis, despite the warnings of the scientists. And I think the parallels to the climate and nature crisis are absolutely clear. So the stakes are incredibly high for this budget. And, you know, if the government is serious about recovering better, if it is serious about building better, if the rhetoric needs to be matched up with reality, for me, there are three things that absolutely must get right in this budget. The first, as others have said, is to invest in the green recovery with a fiscal stimulus that can create jobs. Everyone, from the IMF, the OECD, the IFS here, are saying that governments must not stop investing, stop supporting their economies for the foreseeable future. There is complete consensus across the political spectrum on this now. And the thing for me is, if government is having to pump huge amounts into the economy to stimulate it, why not gear it towards green? So that we're responding to this crisis in a way that sets us up to respond to the bigger crisis of climate change and the ecological crisis. Germany has announced an economic stimulus worth about 130 billion euros, and that contains about 30 billion euros in green job creation. By contrast, the UK government has announced a disappointing 8 billion of investment targeted at green jobs through its green industrial strategy, about 6 billion of additional investment in zero carbon infrastructure, such as upgrading homes and public buildings and cycling and walking infrastructure. But the majority of this has come from basically reprofiling existing spending commitments that were made pre-COVID, rather than bringing forward these commitments, yes, but then looking to significantly ramp them up. And for me, the really worrying sign in the autumn mini spending round that we had was the fact that the Chancellor chose, and it was a choice, to cut day-to-day spending by 10 to 12 billion every year from this year, and provided no additional infrastructure spending beyond that which was committed beyond COVID. Again, I come back to the point, if we are serious about recovering better, if we are serious about a green recovery, then this can't be the road that he goes under. He's got to be in stimulate rather than consolidate mode. We've done a huge amount of work on what this green fiscal stimulus could look like, drawing on the work of the Committee of Climate Change. And we think that if the government was willing to pump in something like 28.3 billion of investment into critically energy efficiency, building on Lord Turner, installing insulation, heat pumps over the next 18 months, this could unlock something like 400,000 jobs within the next 2 years. Both direct jobs doing these things, but also the jobs it would create through the supply chain. We think this can be complemented by a further 20 billion of investment into what we call social infrastructure. So social sector jobs that are absolutely critical coming out of the pandemic, public health, social care, public local services that are labor intensive in nature and inherently low carbon therefore. And again, the modeling that we've done suggests that that scale of investment could create about 700 additional jobs. So if we get this right, the government would not only be creating low carbon jobs to stem the rise in unemployment, but taking action to significantly accelerate the transition to low carbon. And as others had said, and picking on the conversation and the point that Barry made, it's not just about creating jobs, it's how quickly and effectively you can skill people up to take up these jobs. And how you do this in a way that manages the transition so that it is just. And here I think some of the ideas around job protection schemes that have now been popularized through the pandemic create a really important policy instrument for us. It creates a way in which businesses in sectors that are declining can bring back their employers for a shorter working week, so that they are spreading essentially one job across 2 employees to keep them engaged in the labour market, because we know if people disengage, it's much harder for them to get back into the labour market. The government subsidising wages for non-working time, and then offering those workers the opportunity to retrain during those non-working hours for the types of jobs that are being created in the green economy, in the social economy. And then this becomes a key enabler for the just transition that would work just as well for the hospitality sector in the short term as it would work for aviation or the fossil fuel industry as we move forward. In terms of how we would fund this fiscal stimulus, in the short term, honestly, the quickest and the most effective way is to borrow at 0 to negative interest rates. But I think once we lock in the principle of large-scale green investment as part of the short-term fiscal stimulus, then this needs to be built into a longer-term funding settlement and commitment. And, you know, in my view, in the way that we target 2% of GDP going into defense, we should be coming out of this crisis with a comparable, and I would argue higher, commitment to greening the economy in every single budget as a percentage of GDP, funded through a combination of borrowing as we do for capital investment and taxation. But critically, fiscal policy will have to work hand in glove with monetary policy, with the Bank of England playing a critical role in guiding finance in support through caps and quotas for dirty and clean investment, as well as a deliberate policy of directing newly created money into green finance. And Lord Turner touched on the mechanism for doing that. But again, through this investment programme, create jobs to replace the ones that we lost, but critically, we seek to transform the nature of our economy. I think the second big priority for me is protecting incomes in this budget. We're seeing a huge income squeeze in this country. So, you know, the data, the analysis we've done is back in September, there were 20.6 million people living below the minimum income standard. So that's essentially the level of income that below which people are struggling to keep their head above water day to day, are struggling to afford bread and butter things. Our modelling suggests that actually between September and April, this number is likely to rise by about 2.5 million, which is absolutely staggering. What's more staggering is that this comes off the back of a decade in which living standards were flatlined, in which living standards didn't budge, driven by stagnating wages. And the OBR is now forecasting that wages are going to go down by about £1,200 a year per worker by 2025 compared to pre-pandemic levels. I mean, that is absolutely astonishing and unprecedented. Decade stagnation, decline. So for me, this has to be a priority. And in part, this can be done by extending furlough, which I think the Chancellor has to do until well after we've opened the economy in July, if that's where we end up, to allow businesses and workers to manage the transition without a huge spike in unemployment. And I also think that another critical part of it is the introduction of what we call minimum income guarantee. So essentially £227 per person that can provide a safety net for anyone that needs it, can be provided through the universal credit system and paid quickly. And this would be a step change for us for the medium-term goal of getting to a living income. So a level of income below which no one can fall, which ensures that they can afford the basics for a decent quality of life, achieved in part by actually delivering a living wage rather than a minimum wage that we call a living wage, increasing it over time as we recover, and then combining that with reforms to the social security system to ensure that we embed a proper minimum income guarantee. And then the final thing I'd say before we wrap up, the third thing that's got to get right is making real this commitment to levelling up. And that is both about a big investment program. So if you've got a fiscal stimulus, how are you pumping it into communities to ensure that we begin to rebuild and breathe life back into our communities? But this, and this is not one for the budget, but has to be a key part of the recovery program, must be complemented by a radical program of devolution so that we're pushing resources, powers down into communities as part of a Green New Deal for places. So we're equipping local leaders working in partnership with business, trade unions, communities to think about how they transform and transition their economies in a way that is just. And I'll stop there.
Miatta, thank you so much for that fantastic contribution. I can see, Barry, that's not a legacy hand, is it? I take it that's a real hand. I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come to you next. I'm just going to abuse the chair's position to ask you a question. I've listened to what you've said. I think I find it very difficult to be optimistic about what will come out of the budget. And it seems that the government are ideologically opposed to a lot of what you've said, or vast swathes of the government are opposed to what you've said. If the budget doesn't live up to the expectations of what you've outlined there, how much more difficult does it become for future administrations to be able to get this right off of the back of this pandemic and this critical budget that we know is a kind of make or break budget, especially with COP26 and all the other commitments that are coming down the line? How much more difficult does it become for us?
It becomes hugely difficult. If they don't take action to both accelerate the pathway to low carbon, which we know we need to do because we've got 10 years, our road is limited, and they don't take action to tackle the massive living standard squeeze, it embeds something that is really unprecedented and makes it really hard for other administrations to play catch up, which is why I think it's really important. I'm a bit more hopeful, in part because I think the politics will force some movement. I think when we start seeing the impacts of the squeeze in living standards in our communities, and the pandemic has been dominated by the public health side of things. The images in our heads of the public health awful part of this pandemic. The families that can't eat or feed themselves, that's only going to get worse as we come out of the tail end. The economic picture of the pandemic is the thing that I think we're going to see over the course of the next year to 2 years. And I think that will make it very, very hard for the government not to move. On the green transition, from everything I'm picking up from officials and from the other side, I think there's a genuine commitment to it. It's about the scale of ambition to deliver against that commitment. And again, here, I think there's a real opportunity if we can bring together green transition, particularly in the context of COP and G7, when the UK is trying to play a leadership role internationally, combined with the levelling up agenda, which there is a political imperative for them to deliver on. In 5 years' time, you cannot go back to the electorate and wear all seats and not have demonstrated some sort of progress. I think that does create the political space for them to act, to be thinking about the sorts of investment and how you do that in a way. And I think it's the job of, both parliamentarians pushing, opposition parties pushing, but also the huge swathe of civil society that is completely united around this to make it impossible for the government not to budge. The final thing I'd say is, this isn't the only budget. It's a really critical one, but coming out of this budget, I suspect what they will do is, this is a wait and see budget. So they'll roll forward some interventions into July, they'll do a couple of things and just wait and see. The gamble being that actually as soon as you open up, everything goes back. The economy rebounds and everything's fine and they don't have to worry about it. I think come the autumn, it will become clear that that is not playing out. And so as we go into the autumn budget, they still need to do a spending round. I think that's the space to apply pressure for some of these big interventions. So this is critical, but it's not the last saloon.
It's a really, really, really useful answer. Sorry, thank you for that. Sounds like I was congratulating myself then. Sorry. So it's a really, really useful answer, especially the last part. Thank you. Barry, over to you.
Congratulate you, Clive. Always happy to provide that assistance. Great. Miatta, look, when I started philosophy, I was always told if you've got two irreconcilable arguments and you don't like them, then it's a contradiction. But if you do like them, it's called a paradox. Now, it seems to me that when you're talking about job protection schemes, and I go right along with you, shorter working week, don't let people disengage from the workplace, use those spare hours to retrain. What are you going to say to the people who would have kept their full-time job that you sacrificed in order to allow everybody to remain in the workplace to some extent? And in doing so, here's the contradiction or the paradox, you automatically impact on protecting incomes, which is your second argument. So it seems to me that there's a real tension here between the two things that you and I would both want to see, that ability to maintain people in the workforce, to get them to retrain during that period, but also maintain their living standards in the meantime. Now, I didn't see a resolution to that central clash.
So really good question. And there is a tension there. And for me, the two ways in which we square that tension is, I think the kind of part-time, part-training scheme makes sense in industries that are declining. So we know we're going to see a contraction in hospitality. I don't think it will be sustained. I think it will bounce back, but there will be a contraction in the short term. But more fundamentally, We know that there's going to be a contraction in aviation. We know there's going to be a contraction in fossil fuel industries. So it's less a question of it's your job or someone else's job. The jobs are going. And actually, how are we going to manage that transition in a way that provides some protection for everyone? I think that's the deal. That in the end, you don't know if it's going to be your job or your colleague's job, but we know jobs are going and they're going to go fast. So actually, let's pool the risk between ourselves. And then on the other side, I think the way in which you do provide some income protection is the key point about the government subsidizing wages for non-working hours. You know, Germany already clocked this in the last financial crisis. We've now kind of seen the benefits of this. I mean, without the furlough scheme, this pandemic would have been an absolute catastrophe. I mean, it's already awful, but it would be an absolute catastrophe. And for me, we've got to win that principle. And the government is not there, and neither are officials who, you know, they're just desperate to wind this expensive thing up and move on and never think about it again. But that principle of there is a role for subsidizing, particularly if it means that you mitigate huge numbers of people being dumped into a labour market that cannot absorb them quickly enough, and all the additional costs that roll up from that.
Brilliant. I've got a couple of questions from the Q&A, Miatta, so I'll just read one to you now. In addition to allocating capped decarbonisation, how do we address the wealth transfer that has happened as a result of quantitative easing?
Very, very good question. Well, I'm hoping Robert will pick up on some of the tax mechanisms that we can use to do that. So I won't go into that. But in addition to, I think, some of the ways that we need to think about how we use the taxation system to mitigate that, you know, I do think one of the opportunities when we talk about, you know, green investment or green infrastructure and services is if we are, you know, Lord Turner made the point that there is huge space for private investment. Of course there is, and we must capitalize and exploit that. But we're also going to need large-scale public investment to catalyze any of this and to de-risk it in some extent. And if you are going to pump in huge amounts of public investment, there is a huge opportunity to think about the ownership structures around that. You know, so I would like to see some of that investment at a local level being geared into cooperatives, into mutuals, into collectively owned infrastructure, so that as these start to pay dividends, they don't go to a subset of the population or a hedge fund, or, you know, they go to people and communities. And through that, we're not just creating wealth, but we're thinking about how we can redistribute wealth. So I think that has to be part of the agenda. Hard to do it completely at the national level, although you can create incentives and mechanisms, but a critical part of the story about how local economies deliver Green New Deal in places.
Yeah, that's I think thank you for that. And I think the next question kind of ties into that. It's about those vested interests that have done very well from the current system. How do you begin to mitigate that with this extra spending? And the question here is how would a balance be reintroduced between local enterprise and the large monopolies, the regulation of private banks, and others who at the moment are benefiting quite handsomely from the current system?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think there are two stages. I think there's an immediate stage, because actually one of the ironies of the pandemic is that some people have been really hammered, and then some people have done extraordinarily well from the pandemic. And, you know, I think governments here and elsewhere will need to be thinking about windfall tax type mechanisms. You know, how do you find ways of retrospectively clawing some of that back in order to kind of pump into your recovery effort? In the longer term, you know, I do think this speaks to, you know, and this isn't just for the Chancellor, I think it's a wider agenda, but I think there has to be a new deal and a new contract with businesses. And the encouraging thing is, you know, if you listen to everything from the CBI to some of the business leaders, there is a window there where actually everyone's saying, look, we've got to reset. And the government needs to grip that and say, we are pumping huge amount of support to businesses, rightly so. They've got to do that because they are the kind of lifeblood and jobs are dependent. But in return for this, when we come out of this, we've got to, you know, things like ground and down workers, 0-hour contracts, we cannot have that. You've got to have a different type of settlement where actually there is social purpose built into the responsibility of business. And it is as much about the contribution you make to your community and society, as well as your environmental contribution, as it is the bottom line and, you know, generating a dividend for shareholders. And we should not miss the opportunity to do that, because I think there is a thread in the business community that would allow that kind of conversation. And my worry at the moment is not significantly on the government's agenda. There's no talk of conditionality, let alone kind of, after the event contracts, and there absolutely needs to be. Thank you,
Miatta. I think we're now going to move on. I think we're on time. So thank you so much for your contribution, Miatta. And as ever, I like to hope that we can be in touch with you if we need more follow-up information and any further questions. So thank you. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Clive, and thanks, Miatta. That was fantastic. And thank you, Robert, for your patience. I'm really glad that you're here, and to welcome you, Robert Palmer, Chief Executive of Tax Justice UK. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. So Tax Justice UK, briefly, is a campaign group trying to get a fairer and more effective tax system here in the UK. Tax can play a really important role in supporting the green transition. And at the moment, our tax system is not set up for the challenges we face, whether COVID recovery or dealing with climate breakdown. But any tax reforms have to be accompanied by strong regulation to change individual and corporate behaviour. And as Lord Turner said, a lot of the cost of a green transition will largely be funded by very cheap and sustainable debt or money creation, with tax playing a supporting role. Now, many are saying that this budget is not the time for tax rises. And it's really true, as Miatta has made clear, that we should not be taking money out of the economy right now. We need a significant stimulus. But this isn't a binary issue. And some tax rises, tax changes do make sense now, especially if you're talking about tackling environmental or climate breakdown or tackling inequality. And the IPPR think tank has a paper coming out this week showing that some tax changes, such as higher corporation tax, are unlikely to undermine the economic recovery. So I think this is really, really important. Yes, we want to keep pumping money into the economy. So we don't want overall tax rises. We definitely don't want tax rises on most people, but there are definitely some tax changes that we could and should be doing right now. At Tax Justice UK, we're starting to work with green and tax groups to start to set out some principles for how climate and tax policies should be linked. And this needs to be rooted in justice. So what is the justice around how we link the tax system to a green and just transition? And I think there are four key areas that we'd like to see. So the first area is to think about how we tax carbon and environmentally destructive behavior in a progressive way. Now, as I've said, tax is just one tool the government has to try and change behaviour, and the government needs to be really careful when it does this, and also needs to be really clear on what the aims are. For example, is this about raising revenue or changing behaviours? And as we all know, many taxes on carbon are effectively consumption taxes and can end up being regressive. And we've seen in France what happens where they introduced a hike in fuel duty while at the same time scrapping a wealth tax, and that led to the Gilets jaunes. And so instead we should be thinking about smart ideas such as a frequent flyer levy, ending tax subsidies for carbon producers, and really thinking about how we can focus on the 100 companies in the UK which are responsible for 71% of all emissions. So the first point is tax carbon and an environmentally destructive way, environmentally destructive behaviour in a progressive way. The second point is to think about how progressive tax reform can help support extra government spending on the green transition. You know, tax revenues will play a key component of ongoing funding of various forms of green measures, and we need to make sure that those tax reforms and those tax changes are progressive and don't hit the poorest. So for example, I would argue the government should avoid doing what governments in the past have done, which is increase things like VAT, and think about more progressive forms of tax change. So the second point is we need progressive tax reform to help support extra green spending on both the green transition and the COVID recovery. Which brings me to my third point, which is how we can use tax reform to tackle inequality. Wealth inequality is a major problem, and as the questioner pointed out on the previous discussion, this has been made significantly worse by COVID. We're in this really bizarre situation in some ways where we're living during the biggest recession we've seen in hundreds of years, And yet the stock market and housing prices have rocketed. And those increases in asset prices are benefiting the wealthy. And partly this is the flip side of the government and the Bank of England pumping so much money into the economy through QE. So it's really important, including if money creation, QE, the sort of thing that Lord Turner was talking about, is used as a way of funding a green transition, this needs to be accompanied by higher taxes on wealth to claw back some of that unfair increase in asset increases. There's also obviously a climate dimension. Oxfam have said that the wealthiest 1% in the UK use 11 times the carbon as someone in the poorest half of the population. Options here that are being discussed include higher corporation tax, a wealth tax, increases to capital gains tax. And then the final point is that the government should really think about the leverage it has through incentives, procurement, bailouts to insist on good tax behaviour from companies. And we've seen some of this being worked into COVID bailouts, but frankly, the conditionality is pretty weak. And so that's a really key thing, like what are the levers that the government has to really push and incentivize good tax behavior? So those four things are: we need to tax carbon and environmentally destructive behavior in a progressive way. We need progressive tax reform to help support extra green spending. We need tax reform to tackle inequality. And the government should think about using the leverage it has over companies to encourage good tax behavior. Now, the positive thing is the public supports this agenda. We've done significant public attitudes project with the University of Sheffield and Survation, which shows there is a strong support for more spending as we build back, with almost half of the population willing to pay more tax themselves. But this comes with a condition. They will do that as long as wealthy individuals and big companies are seen as paying their fair share. So to sort of wrap up, I think we have a historic opportunity right now to reform the tax system so that it supports our recovery from COVID and the green transition. And like Miatta, I'm quite optimistic around this. I think the debate and discourse we have at tax is really fascinating at the moment, with a whole range of people on the centre right as well as the centre left making many of the arguments that I have just made. And so I think it's really important that we continue to push this government and other politicians that fair tax justice is a core part of climate justice and getting us both out of COVID and thinking about a green transition. Thank you.
Brilliant, Robert. Thank you so much for that. Really, really inspirational. Can I kick off just with a couple of questions? On the wealth tax, for which I am a great advocate, but often when we put forward that proposal, then the pushback is, well, it doesn't actually raise very much revenue and so forth. And do you think one of the strongest arguments for the wealth tax is about the money it raises, or about the permission it gives you, in a sense, to do lots of other tax changes that you were describing? And I wonder, so in terms of putting forward that policy to government, for example, I wonder how you would frame it to get the best response. And on the carbon tax issue, you make a very persuasive argument for using it in a very smart way to make sure that it is progressive and so on. The government is picking up this idea, I think, a little bit of a carbon tax, and may well be doing it on a rather more blanket way than perhaps we would choose. Do you have any mitigating strategies around how you would try to ensure perhaps that the revenue from that carbon tax, for example, came back in wealth funds or distributed to communities, or what would you do with perhaps what looks to you as a suboptimal carbon tax, but nonetheless is one which is being rolled out by government? How would you try to mitigate so that it becomes as progressive as possible?
Yeah, thank you. That's really two very good questions. On the first one, wealth is really undertaxed at the moment in a whole range of areas. And you could raise substantial amounts of money. There was an LSE and University of Warwick-led wealth tax commission, and they had a range of proposals that they costed. And they said a single one-off 5% tax on net wealth over 2 million could raise £81 billion. So that is really, that's a chunk of change there. There are other things you could do on an ongoing basis. The government's own Office for Tax Simplification says that if you equalised rates of income from wealth with income from work by raising capital gains tax, you could raise £14 billion a year. So these are big big amounts of money, and particularly for a government which has got a manifesto commitment, which it says it wants to meet, of not raising income tax, VAT or national insurance, its options are fairly limited. So I think it can both tackle inequality and raise money, and raise quite substantial money. And then using carbon tax in a smart way. I have to admit, I am not the carbon tax expert, but I definitely think a lot of work is being done on how you can think about pricing carbon in a way that doesn't hit the poorest hardest, because what I do know about is the politics. And if you introduce a tax where poor people see their bills rising substantially, you are quickly going to lose political support for your agenda around a green transition. So there are definitely, much better experts on carbon tax than me looking at the specific ways in which you can mitigate it and make it more progressive. But also, I think the key point is around political consent for a green transition. And there's some really good work that ECF did looking at public attitudes around green transition. And they found support for this type of agenda, but only if it was seen as fair and not hitting the poorest.
Great, thank you very much. Barry has a hand.
Thanks, Robert. Look, certainly on carbon tax, I think we are seeing carbon border adjustment tax come into play. Interestingly, that goes against many, well, the word that you used repeatedly, progressive notions, in that it's something that this government will find an easy tax to put in place because it doesn't hit people's pockets. It's seen as protectionist. And of course, the people that it potentially does harm are the poor overseas, who actually need the resource in order to decarbonize themselves. And I think it's really important that as politicians, those of us are making that argument about carbon border adjustment tax when it comes, as I think inevitably it will. But look, I felt that you've given me 4 sets of parentheses, and you used liberally the words progressive, just, and good as adjectives, without actually giving me the specifics of what those, how to tax carbon in a progressive way. Well, let's get on to it. How to tax reform can support a just transition, and incentives for good tax behavior. Well, what are they? What are the incentives that we can put in place? So I've got these boxes here that you've given me. I want to be able to fill them in. Sorry, push back.
So that's a very, very good point, particularly on the carbon border adjustment tax. Like, justice isn't just what happens in this country, it has to happen globally. In terms of incentives for good tax behaviour, there's already some small things the government does. So, for example, companies can write off investment in certain green investments through something called capital allowances, which means they can write it off against their corporation tax. There are ways in which you could increase the scope of investment through the capital allowances system to encourage good investment in green transition.
But you see, you haven't talked about tackling the subsidy regime, and capital allowances are so well used to give subsidies to the oil and gas industry. What was it, 70% capital allowances to fracking? That the government boasted was the highest anywhere in the world. Surely these are the areas that we actually need to be going in on, and understanding that there are no such thing as environmental taxes. All our taxes are environmental. We're embedded in the environment. We're part of nature, and actually every tax, either incentive or tax caution that government does, every disincentive by taxation, every incentive by capital allowances has an impact on our environment. And we've got to embed that in the Treasury's thinking, rather than think, oh yeah, there are tweaks that we can make which are called environmental taxes or environmental allowances. And actually, going back to what Dr. Morrissey from New Zealand was saying, have a way of ensuring that every single bid for a new tax or a cut in tax is being evaluated against its environmental and climate impact.
Totally, and you're right that there's whole ways in which our current tax system subsidizes environmentally destructive behavior. And you know, the G20 has talked about ending carbon subsidies, and fossil fuel subsidies, and yet we haven't seen that in the UK. So there's a lot that can be done. I mean, I also think
we don't accept they exist. The Treasury will not accept that these are subsidies.
And so I think more needs to be done on how the tax system enables environmentally destructive behavior. There can be more incentives within the tax system to encourage behavior change. But I would also come back to the point that I made at the beginning, that I think the tax system is just one way in where we get it, one way in which we get where we need to, and that actually on some things the government is just going to simply have to regulate behavior so that companies produce less carbon, because there's some fairly hard limits on what you can do with the tax system. The kind of point I want to leave is that I think when we're thinking, I like your idea about all taxes should be environmental, and I would just, as a plea to people working on climate, to engage with other elements of the tax system which are absolutely vital to our green transition. So whether it's how we tax wealth, how elements of our tax system are regressive, like all of that is bound up. For example, you know, QE to fund climate, that is potentially going to drive up inequality because it's going to lead to asset price inflation. So how do we use other elements of the tax system to link up? And so I very much support your idea of not just focusing on taxes which are badged as environmental, and thinking in a much more holistic way around how the tax system can be used to get us where we need to on a whole load of things, climate being an important one.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Barry. I think there's time just for one question from the Q&A chat box. There's a question saying, why not charge a progressive tax for fuel so that, for example, the first 100 units charged at X amount of pounds, and then the second unit at, you know, plus 20%, plus 30%, and so on, so that rich gets charged more and the poor can be charged below cost and subsidised?
It's a good question. I don't know about the practicalities of how you do it. There is a proposal called the frequent flyer levy, which would do a similar thing for flights. So you'd get one flight tax-free, and then the more flights you took, the more you would pay. Because I think one of the big challenges is we don't want to introduce some form of carbon taxation which just allows the rich to pay their way out of their responsibility of reducing carbon. And so I think that's, again, why I'm a bit nervous about carbon taxation as a primary vehicle for changing behaviour, is there is a risk, if it's set up in the wrong way, that yet again, the rich will buy their way out and it will be the poor who end up paying.
Thanks. And just before I go back to Clive, I just wanted to pick up on a theme that's come out from some other questions sort of throughout the morning, which has been that the importance really of making sure that our energy transition doesn't come at the expense of the global south, something that we absolutely agree with. And I just wanted to probably abuse my position too much to say that people might be interested in a Green Party event, which we're holding with the Alliance for Responsible Mining, Imperial College London and Earthworks, to discuss some of those issues and solutions, because it is obviously a very big issue that you can't have a green transformation in the north that's built off the back of people in the south, and that is a very real risk, I think. So I think Ruth or Holly might put the details of that meeting in the chat box for people that might be interested in that, and it could well be the subject of a future meeting. But in the meantime, let me hand back to Clive to wrap up.
Thanks, Caroline. So it's been a fantastic and a very informative debate today that we've had a discussion. I'd like to thank all of our experts, those that are here and those that have already left, for their thoughtful contributions that they've made today. I think it's looking clear that the need to rebuild the economy after COVID in a way that addresses the climate and nature crises at something approaching the scale and speed that the science tells us is necessary, and how we might ensure that it is also fair and contributes to the levelling up of the nation, remains the overarching challenge of our times. It'll determine our future and define our legacies. And we all saw the speed at which multiple vaccines were developed and are now being rolled out, a development that shows what we are capable of where the political will exists. There will, however, be no vaccine against the destruction of nature and runaway climate change. But if we seize this moment, we cannot only set ourselves on the path to meeting our Paris commitments, we can also reverse inequality and the damage done by 40 years of economic hyperliberalization. And we've already heard here today that it's entirely possible, that the vision, the capacity, and the public desire already exist. What we need is the political will. So we wait to see what the Chancellor has in his red box next Wednesday. For now, I'd like to thank our fellow MPs and peers for their helpful questions today. Thank you too to the policy community for your ongoing work and for your questions today. And most of all, thank you to our speakers for your time today and for all that you do to make sure that this time we really do build back better. Thank you very much.